Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com, how to make knife handles using Hybridwood. Now for this particular knife project, this is a Bowie knife that I made. I wanted to make a really unique handle or scales. I wanted to kind of move out of the box of my ordinary and do something a little bit different. So I decided to do a composite knife scale using at least two different materials. I ended up with a design that showcased Hybridwood from knifekits.com. Now, Hybridwood, which is shown in the middle here, it's the blue and the reddish brown, is actually a stabilized and dyed burl that is then cast in resin. The particular color that I picked has a passion red burl and then a sapphire blue metallic resin. The completed handle uses micarta liners and spacers. The Hybridwood is kind of showcased in the middle, and the hardwood on either side is cocobolo. So the process basically began with a search on the web. I was just looking for some unique materials to use on the blade. I came across this site, knifekits.com, and they had some pretty cool products. The one that caught my eye was the Hybridwood. And again, as I mentioned before, this is a stabilized and dyed burl, wood burl, that is cast in a metallic resin. It comes in a block, and then you can cut it down to the size that you need for the scales that you're working on. They also had some other exotic hardwoods on the site. So once I received the block of this Hybridwood, I brought it over to my friend Jay's shop, and on a table saw, he just cut it down. We cut 1/4 inch sections. It actually cut pretty easily. Now, this is one of those pieces that was trimmed down, and I certainly could have used just this Hybridwood and just glued it in place, pinned it in place, and formed it. That alone would have made a pretty cool knife handle. But again, I wanted to push the envelope a little bit with my skills, try something new, and I decided to cut that down and really kind of picture frame it or showcase it in the middle or wedged in between darker hardwoods. Now, I am by no means an expert at this. This total assembly, this is my first, I was playing around here with ebony on either side, but I ended up not liking the look of that. I went with the cocobolo, which also has a little bit of red in it, and it kind of brought out the highlights of the red in the Hybridwood. Now again, I am no expert at this. The final assembly, composite assembly, I think it's 13 pieces if I count all of the micarta liners and spaces, and the cocobolo as well as the Hybridwood. 13 pieces per side. So this was a little bit of a stretch for me, a balancing act per se. The design that I came up with is I cut a couple of small sections of the cocobolo and the Hybridwood. This is actually the thickness of the wood. So I cut a cross section. I've got blue micarta spacers in between each. And now I'm just going to kind of figure out how to glue these all together. What I'm doing is I'm just marking basically the outline of the tang of the knife. But if you notice with that same marker, I'm going to go back, I'm going to put two little marks on one side. This is just positioning. So when I glue up this knife handle, I can line up all of those marks, and hopefully everything will still be in correct position. I'm going to use a two-part epoxy. And what I've done is I've taken a piece of glass and created a nice flat surface, covered that with parchment paper so the glue doesn't stick. And then I clamped down a couple of pieces of wood on one side of that. So basically I created a very flat table that the glue is not going to stick to. I put the first piece of wood down, only gluing the side away from the wood. I don't want to glue it onto that wood. And then I'm going to start to glue both sides of the micarta spacer and then the hybrid wood, and I'm going to slowly assemble this half of the knife scale. And I'm only doing the edges. I'm not doing the back or the bottom. And my goal here is just to glue together the first part of the assembly. I'm actually going to leave the last micarta spacer and cocobolo piece off right now. I just want to get this front half glued together. I'm going to use just a brick or a paver just to hold that in position, kind of add a little bit of pressure to it, and I'm going to make sure that all of the pieces are pushed down flat against that parchment paper. I'm going to do the exact same thing, kind of a mirror image, for the other half, the other knife scale. Now in the future, I would make slightly larger, more uniform shaped pieces. This is really just an experiment. I did it with a lot of small pieces of wood, but in the future I'll probably make a jig for this and have all of the knife material being the same width, so you'd have a flat edge on the side as well as the front. And I would probably do it larger and then cut that front angle. The front angle on the piece that I'm working with has already been cut to match the angle on the bolster. But that's how this assembly is going to start to come together. I then went back and did the exact same thing and glued the cocobolo and the spacer for the tail end of that scale. And then I'm just sanding everything completely flat on a belt sander. So it's not very pretty yet, but this is how they come out. This is not very strong as it is. The next step adds a lot of strength to this assembly. I'm going to add the micarta liners. So what I've done is I've taken a blue and a black micarta liner. I've glued those together with two-part epoxy. I'm then adding some of the same two-part epoxy to the back side of the composite scales that I'm working on. And then I'm going to press that right into the micarta. And when that dries, this is going to really become a fairly strong knife scale. It will have the backing of the micarta, really adds a lot of rigidity to the whole composite. And I'll just walk away from that until it dries. I'll glue up the other half. When that's done, I'm going to just outline with a marker the outline of the knife handle, and then I can actually cut that out. You could use a bandsaw. I just used a pin saw for it. I do want to cut it out slightly oversized. I want to leave myself a little bit of room for error, and I want to grind this down to match the tang of the blade perfectly on the grinder after the knife handles have been attached. So I use the Northgard method of attaching knife scales, and it's particularly useful, especially when you have a brass bolster in place, because you really want those scales to be pressed nice and tight against the bolster. And sometimes it's difficult to get the holes lined up doing it other ways. The Northgard method is very simple. You basically glue one half of the knife scales onto the blade, clamp it into position, get it exactly where you want it, nice and tight up to the bolsters. clamp it into position and let that dry. Then you drill holes through using the holes that are pre-drilled through the handle of the knife to guide the drill bit through that half of the scales. Then you basically do the exact same thing on the other side. You glue up the other knife scale on the other side, you clamp it, you get it nice and tight to the bolsters, and then your drill bit goes through the knife handle that you already drilled through and the blade as a guide in order to drill through the other side. It sounds difficult, but it's not. It's a multiple step process. It takes a little bit of time, but the end result is scales that are perfectly placed and nice and tight up against that bolster. So anyway, all I've done here is I've glued and clamped the first half onto the blade. Now I'm going to position my drill bit perfectly through the pre-existing holes on the blade. I'll clamp that whole assembly down to the table on my drill press. I do want to have a board underneath it that will prevent any splintering out the backside of the scales. And then I'm going to drill right through so that that hole is absolutely perfect through the handle of the blade as well as the scales. And now what I've done is I've glued and clamped the other half of the scales on. I've let that dry. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to that drill press. I'm going to use that first hole as the guide. I'm going to put my drill right through that first hole without the drill press being on, right through the steel of the blade. Then I'll clamp everything down and I'll drill my holes. The end result is holes that are perfectly in line. And now it's easy to assemble with the pins. I'm just using the same 2-part epoxy on 2 brass pins. In this case, they're 1/4 inch brass. You could use stainless, you could use copper, you could use mosaic pins. I actually had mosaic pins. I decided not to use them. With how dynamic this handle material was, it was just kind of taking away from the beauty of that hybrid wood. After the pins are dried, you can shape this material just like you do any knife scales. I do some of the shaping on a 2x72 grinder. The inside edge, and actually a lot of the knife handle, I actually prefer to shape it with an angle grinder or a disc grinder. I use a flap sanding wheel with an 80 grit flap sanding wheel, and I bring the whole outside edge of that handle material even with the tang of the knife. And then I can actually start to form those scales with that same flap sanding wheel. You have to be really careful with it though. You can move a lot of material very quickly, and it's very easy to remove too much material. Just be very careful of it. I've done a decent amount of wood carving with these disc grinders, and I just find it very easy to rough shape the handles with that flap sanding wheel. And after that, it's just a little bit of sanding. I sanded with an 80 grit paper, then I went down to a 220. After that, you up for a little bit of hand sanding. You want to get off all of those scratch marks from the 220. And I hand sanded with a 600 grit, and then I very quickly hand sanded with 1000 grit. And all of these processes included sanding the bolsters at the same time. Final process is just buffing out the handle and the bolsters, and of course also the pins, the brass pins. Doesn't really take long at all. Overall, I was very, very happy with this hybrid wood material. I thought it really enhanced this particular knife project. If anybody's interested, that particular material is available from a company called knifekits.com. Again, this is a hybrid wood material that is sandwiched in between hardwood, dark hardwood called cocobolo. I also added a little spine etching to enhance that blade even more. I've covered spine etching on other videos, and I'll put a link up on this one. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Please check us out on the web at DIYEasyCrafts.com and check out our other how-to knife making videos. Thank you very much.